Thank you, Eamon. Thank you, everybody, again coming out on what's turned out to be a really windy night. It's good to see you. Thank you for the invitation to speak at this event. Now, let's see if I can get myself going right. Okay. Simone de Beauvoir famously said that one is not born a woman, but becomes one. A statement which became central to the feminist movement of the 1960s and 70s, known as the second wave. De Beauvoir argued that it is society, its values and its mores, which constructs us in a particular way, and that its assumptions and expectations about what it is to be a woman are determining influences on female lives and experiences. History is one of the key factors in this process, shaping our ideas of who we are, our role in personal, social, economic and political life, determining what we and others believe we can or cannot do, whether consciously or unconsciously. Reinforced by politics, economics, religion, the mainstream discourse has produced the traditional woman of mainstream society, she of the dominant discourse. So it's worth looking at the process of history. I don't believe there was any kind of conspiracy to keep women out of the narrative. Like most forms of knowledge, history has been subject to critical scrutiny in recent decades, with feminism, postmodernism, and indeed post-feminism, interrogating and challenging traditional sources, narratives, and methodologies. While debates continue to both clarify and problematize theoretical positions, there's now general agreement that the writing of history is not an innocent or transparent affair. Shaped by outside forces, its inclusions, exclusions, assumptions and interpretations produce powerful, partial, often competing versions of the truth. And this is particularly relevant to so-called post-conflict societies, where, as Heiner put it, the past is often the first and most contentious issue on the agenda. In a context where reconstructions of past events become inextricably linked to contemporary political agendas, who gets to tell the stories which find their way into the public domain, and how and where that telling is done are more than usually important considerations. And of course, this is much too familiar for all of those engaged in Irish history generally. But it is also particularly, and I think specifically relevant to the history of women. Like their personal lives, women's history is fragmented, interrupted, a shadow history of human beings whose existence has been shaped by the efforts and demands of others. It is a task of today's historians to overturn that legacy. And over the past few decades, Irish feminist historians have fully engaged in this task. And we do now, I think, have a very impressive historiography, and that's only a fraction and what I just happen to have available on PowerPoint. But we do now have a real collection of evidence about women's past experience in Ireland. An important aspect of the work of these historians has been the introduction of sources less familiar in established historical work. Court and police records, records of charities, churches, local groups, voluntary organisations, also letters, diaries, and literature and poetry. A particularly fine example of the interdisciplinary use of sources is the 5th volume of Field Day, which interpreted women's writings in the broadest possible way. In her talk on Alice Milligan, Catherine Morris referred to the difference between official and unofficial sources. And indeed we find that the experiential sources, which are most likely to illuminate the unmapped features of women's lives, are often considered to be subjective and therefore lacking in credibility. While historians continue to privilege the voices of the powerful, the influential, and the articulate. I had a nice example from a colleague who talked about a particular archive, the women's materials in a particular archive being catalogued as meaningless gossip, while in fact one of those women actually held an important public position. While there's now greater acceptance of such materials and a more careful digging into the archives, this process has been significant in its own right. revealing the vital importance and the consequences of how things are recorded, archived, and selected. The interpretation and representation of these materials also needs to be subjected to a gendered lens, to uncover examples of the construction, perpetuation, and dissemination of images and ideologies about womanhood. For example, the activities of women who, by engaging in public acts of defiance, stepping outside the boundaries of acceptable female behaviour, have been subjected to manipulation and distortion, particularly in the popular media. And both Margaret Ward and Louise Ryan in particular have drawn our attention to headlines about wild women, fanatics indulging in insane wickedness and criminal folly in the suffrage movement, at the same time as both the Irish and the Ulster volunteer forces were publicly arming themselves for public conflict. So our attempts to reconstruct and interpret the past necessitate constant, rigorous and detailed analysis of the power inherent in both past and present discourses. Previous lectures in this series have already drawn attention to some of the concerns and activities of prominent Irish women in this period. There is much more to be said, however, and much more than we can say this evening. But what we'll do tonight is explore what is generally described as kind of the first wave of feminism during the early decades of the 20th century, a time when women across many countries challenged constitutions which excluded them from the franchise, expressing their ambition to participate in shaping public policy and decision-making at the national level. While the activism of militant suffragists in England is relatively well known, I certainly grew up knowing about the Pankhursts, the parallel suffrage campaign on this island has only much more recently been brought to light, and Dr. Rosemary Cullen-Owens will focus specifically on that movement. The question of national identity, which was the most prominent subject of public political debate for both contemporaries and historians of these years, was of course also of central concern to a great many women who participated in a range of ways in the battle for or against Home Rule. And Dr. Margaret Ward will look in greater detail at the question of female nationalism. So taking into account the challenge of constructing a narrative of the female past, I also faced an added issue here of defining the women's movement. When did it start? When did it stop? Although women did come together in a sustained and organised campaign for inclusion in the national franchise, the motivation of those involved often varied, with personal, social and political backgrounds determining diverse responses to the ongoing constitutional crises in 1912, 1914, 1916, and so on. Thinking back to Mary O'Dowd's lecture in the first event in this series, with the stress on continuity, we can also identify significant continuities and links between the battle for suffrage, for the national vote, and other concerns prioritised by female activists. As Sandra Stanley Holton has stressed, suffrage activity was not marginal, but interrelated with other aspects of the politics of ordinary everyday life, in the tangle of different power structures that determines the complexity of multiple identities. It has become clear that many of those involved in suffrage, from the early period to forever, I could stretch that movement for a very long time, their everyday life focused on charitable and philanthropic endeavours, mostly, though not always, motivated by a religiously determined sense of the social and moral duty of the privileged to those less fortunate. And it's particularly true of the 19th century, I think, in the North, where the influence of evangelicalism motivated a lot of men and women, but also opened many doors for women to operate within their communities. I've just a few slides here from the earlier period of suffragism, the late 19th century, where women like Margaret Byers pursued the ends of higher education for women, or better education for women, together with Isabella Todd, largely responsible for enabling women to attend universities. Isabella Todd also formed the first Northern Ireland Women's Suffrage Society, with Margaret Byers acting as secretary. The Haslams formed the society in Dublin. This is one of my favourite pictures, taken in 1884, the first photograph of graduate women women graduating from an Irish university. I think that's very important, because in the early decades of the 20th century, women working, if you like, in womanly ways for the betterment of other women in society find it much easier to engage in public life. First of all, many of the women who did so were themselves educated. They came from families where the men in society were gaining the vote and moving forward. Many of them were engaged in the middle-class industrial societies of Belfast. Many of them also were leaders within their community in terms of the battle against temperance, or helping women who were engaged in prostitution and so forth. In a great many ways, it seemed to these women that the goal of suffrage would help to move women's causes in many different ways forward. It was also true that by the year, as we already know, by the first decades of the 20th century, society itself was much more likely to be familiar with public displays of protest than it had been a couple of decades earlier. So women, as Rosemary will point out, you can see my difficulty here, what to say and what not to say. Rosemary will look in more detail at the very prominent activists of this wave of women fighting for equality for women for a range of different reasons in the early decades of the 20th century. However, the wider constitutional context in which suffrage was to be granted was also, of course, significant, with important implications for the future citizenship these women were battling for. And the tensions between gender and national aspirations were to become perhaps the most critical factor for politicised women in early 20th century Ireland. As Margaret Ward has noted, the movement for national self-determination that existed in Ireland was as important for women as it was for men. Women believing, many of them, that only in a free Ireland could they also have political freedom. Many that thus joined Cumann na Man, or one of a range of cultural, literary and popular nationalist movements. On the other side of the political divide, the Ulster Women's Unionist Council, formed in 1911, became a magnet for unionist women of all classes. It is claimed that the UWUC became the largest female political organisation in Ireland. And while more research is needed to identify individuals, it's likely that many women from Ulster Presbyterian backgrounds in particular made the move from their local suffrage society to their local unionist associations. Of course, not all did so. A small minority continued to prioritise the suffrage cause, asserting that as suffragists we are to have a single aim until we have the vote. Party politics and party concerns are not for us. And those for whom suffrage was the first priority accused unionist women of participating in a movement in which men were happy to use the women, that they toadied to the Ulster Volunteers. This demonstrates, I think, a failure to acknowledge the different priorities and innate identities of unionist women themselves. As Mrs. Whittaker, secretary of the West Belfast branch of the movement, which had a membership of over 6,000, she explained that for her, women's home rule was essentially a women's question. It affected their lives, their homes and their families. And for that reason, they affirmed their declaration to assist the men in opposing and defeating home rule. With the sanctity and happiness of home life faced with peril and their religious as well as political identity under threat, women's duty was to reject a priest-governed Ireland. So very clear political identity there. The appeal to domesticity, maternalist values and faith ensured the UWUC a strong populist base. But there was also work in the political sphere for women as well as men, with many opportunities for active participation in the constitutional debates raging across Britain and Ireland. Most well known, of course, the signing of the Solemn League and Covenant on the 28th of September 1912, with women showing their solidarity by signing, albeit a supplementary declaration of support. And I think this is a massive evidence of women's political identification with a cause during this time. Many of them also prepared to join the UVF and to arm themselves, or on the other side of the coin, the Irish Citizens' Army or other militant nationalist groups. So, although each side would, for those for whom suffrage was still the absolute top priority, this kind of slavish adherence to one kind of nationalism or another was very difficult. But it is important to acknowledge the multi-layered nature of political identity, the diverse, multifaceted and dynamic nature of Northern Irish women's relationship to the state. Also divisive was militancy itself, which alienated many more moderate women, as it did in other countries battling for the vote. But suffragists on all sides very frequently pointed to the fact, well, again, the UVF and the IVF were arming for their cause, so militancy, if you like, was in the air and was accepted in some quarters, but not in others. English involvement in the suffrage movement, particularly in Belfast, also complicated all these kind of competing identities that women sought to preserve. And although, as we know, that process at that stage of the battle for the vote was brought to an end by war, women continued in all kinds of ways, both privately and publicly, to identify with causes which were dear to them. Whether that was in the 1916 Rising in Cumann, Markievicz, of course, being the most prominent one of these, and of course women from many different sides were involved in the First World War. And the continuity can be taken on and on. It's also, of course, important and very often forgotten that when the Northern Ireland Parliament was formed in 1921, two women took their place in that Parliament, Deirdre Parker and Julie McMordie. They're often forgotten, these women, and I feel sometimes that that's because they were conservative women. They most certainly were not feminists. They were both unionists to the core. But nonetheless, they were a female presence and an important influence in some of Northern Ireland's early debates. So how do we remember all of these different women? One of the things that occurs to me is that one important way to remember them is to think about the causes that they embraced, the reasons why these women sought the vote. It wasn't just to be equal with men. It wasn't an abstract argument. Many of these women visited the law courts regularly, these middle-class suffragettes and suffragists, and saw the way that particularly working-class and poor women were treated by their men. Of course, middle and upper-class women were often treated brutally as well, but that was much less visible. But in the courtrooms, incidences of domestic violence were reported regularly. I was horrified looking at the newspapers in the early 20th century to see how often cases of violence against wives or partners came to the fore. And all these years later, it's still happening. I find this one of the most astonishing, disappointing and disillusioning aspects of looking at our past. These women also were concerned, and the labour movement was very much involved within suffrage, an important strand, to do something about the working conditions in the mills. Now, we're still concerned with women's working conditions, perhaps in different ways. There was a time in the 80s and early 90s, perhaps, when women were trying to juggle all kinds of jobs and looking after children, and getting into the workplace didn't often seem like such a good idea. And even now, when it's so difficult to find employment in the first place, the gender gap in wages remains. The other, another issue that suffrage women were concerned about was slave trafficking. White slavery, it was called at that time. Isn't human trafficking one of the key abuses that we are also familiar with in society today? It seems to me that by working to resolve these ongoing issues, we can perhaps best remember these women of the past. International Women's Day, of course, provides us with an annual public forum for remembering injustices, celebrating progress, and highlighting continuing gender discrimination. However, an understanding of women's engagement with our local political history, whether that's radical, liberal, pacifist, conservative, unionist, nationalist, is worthy of our attention. As I say, these issues are still relevant today. That they were also of concern to earlier generations points to the centrality of such issues to our everyday lives, individually and collectively. An awareness of this continuity should strengthen our resolve to ensure that the past is not marginalised, but rather remains a source of knowledge, strength, and a better understanding of ourselves and the society in which we live. We can do this in a range of ways, by continuing that historical research, by bringing out more books and articles and unearthing the many more experiences that remain hidden. A lot of work is already going on at community level. The Women's Research and Development Agency has been particularly active over the last year or two. And we've got blue plaques, we've got bus tours, we've had the streets renamed. We have had examples of efforts to make women's experience more visible in the city in which we live. Another project that I was involved in was with a group of women in Shankill Women's Centre, where we went up and talked to the women about the suffrage movement, and particularly the exciting events of 1914, which many of the women in the Shankill had never heard about. We introduced them to some of the archives and the newspapers of the period and so forth, and we all discussed what these women had been doing. They then talked with Rita Duffy, who replaced one of the more traditional wall murals on the Shankill Road with this mural, which depicts the women of the Shankill in a range of costumes and with a range of kind of symbolic things in front of them. You could spend ages looking at this and find different things. What Rita said was, I wanted to depict the wider ripples that continue to move the water after the suffragettes first lobbed their brick into Ulster's smooth pond. And it's that line of continuity, which we could take further back, which we can certainly still see now, and which we want to attempt to grapple with in the future, that I think is so important. An exploration of how contemporary expectations and ideals were challenged by female activists in the still ongoing battle for gender equity reveals the complexity and the richness of women's experiences, which have helped to shape the contradictions of our present dilemmas. It's only by continually questioning and problematizing the myriad ways in which the realities of women's lives have been constructed and appropriated in different contexts that we are able not only to hear different voices, but also to validate different responses to the pluralities and complexities of contemporary Northern Irish society. This, I would argue, is of vital importance to the wider agenda of recovery and of progress towards a more inclusive and accepting society. Thank you.